to welcome One of the first things that I'm asked to do is to remind everyone about the conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest with respect to matters before the committee today. Now, today we only have information items. We won't be taking any action, but I thought since we do have some new members, this might be a good time for Councilor Reynolds to go over what a conflict of interest means in this context.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you mentioned at the beginning of every meeting, the State Government Ethics Act requires the chair to remind members of their duty to avoid conflicts of interest, as well as the potential for conflicts of interest or the appearance of conflicts of interest. And as you all know from your ethics training, there are specific definitions in the Ethics Act that relates to identifying a conflict of interest, and that conflict must be identified. It's up to each individual member to identify that conflict because it's part of your duties and responsibilities on the commission, and to ensure that you are acting without the potential or the actual presence of a conflict. And to summarize it, generally speaking, is a conflict related to financial impact. And it doesn't have to be financial gain. Any action that relates to an impact to your finances, again, that's generally speaking, can present a conflict of interest. If the action that even if you were to, for example, vote in favor of an action that would result in a negative impact to some investment or some financial situation that you're in, that still presents a conflict of interest. And so you would need to police yourselves individually, because again, that duty is to you personally. It's a personal requirement for members. Everyone who is subject to the Ethics Act must be mindful of those. And that's why you have to do your ethics training periodically throughout your service to make sure that you're up on the latest requirements, as well as providing updated statements of economic interest to the Ethics Commission, who reviews and evaluates those. And of course, if you ever have any questions, one of the best things about the State Ethics Act is it gives you an opportunity to get some advice of some counsel. So if you have a situation that you're unsure of, one of the things that you're able to do is to consult with the chair and counsel to the commission. And if they determine that you do not have a conflict of interest, then that creates a presumption of correctness or appropriateness in those actions, but it's not an absolute presumption. The only way to get an absolute protection is if you were to file a request to the Ethics Commission for a formal opinion. And if the Ethics Commission issues that formal opinion in your favor in terms of your ability to participate, then that gives you essentially absolute immunity. But there is also the ability for us to consult informally with Ethics Commission staff if it's something we're not certain of. So those opportunities and options are available to you, and we're here to help, obviously, if you need to discuss those. And of course, I'll also direct you to your commission's bylaws about conflicts of interest for when one is identified and how to handle it at that time. And I'll just mention briefly, if I may, Madam Chair, the fact that conflict of interest, and you're going to hear us talk about this, especially in one of the information items that you're going to receive today about interbasin transfers, that avoiding the conflict of interest in that respect is different than what you'll hear me say anytime that you have quasi-judicial matters coming before this body or a committee of this body in the future. And that's what we call a legally impermissible bias that relates to your ability to give full and fair consideration to a matter coming before you based solely on the record. In other words, it prohibits you from considering matters outside of the record and making your decision based on those. I won't get into that part of it in great detail right now because you'll hear me give you those instructions at the time. But I just wanted to note for you that there is a difference between a conflict of interest and a legally impermissible bias.
Thank you very much, Councilor Reynolds. So with that in mind, if any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please so state at this time. Seeing none, we'll proceed to approval of the draft of the Water Allocation Committee meeting minutes from November of 2022. Has everyone had a chance to review those? If so, is there a motion that we approve the minutes? I believe.
Commissioner Solomon, so moves.
Thank you, Commissioner Solomon. Mr. Solomon and I were on this committee at that time. Is there a second?
I'll second. No, please.
Commissioner Tweedy.
Was Commissioner Tweedy seconded? Thank you very much. As you can see, we're going to move to our first information item. Okay, all right. Councilor Reynolds has reminded me that we need to have a vote. So all in favor of approval of the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. All right, before we move to the first information item, I just wanted to say a little bit about this committee and the staff in the Division of Water Resources who supports this committee, and that is the water planning section. And some of the areas that we'll be dealing with in the future include interbasin transfers, the Jordan Lake allocation, the Central Plain capacity use area, river basins, and water use registration. So we are working with staff on future presentations to this committee to provide background on some of these programs. Again, we do have several new committee members, and I take this belated opportunity to welcome all of you. And so at this point, we are going to move to the presentation by Harold Brady on that is the IBT primer and update.
Thank you, Chairperson Weiss. Thank you to the committee. So this is, I'm Harold Brady. I work in the water supply planning branch in the water planning section. I'm the water supply development coordinator and right now the interbasin transfer coordinator. This is a topic that is brought up with some regularity to this committee because the commission issues the interbasin transfer certificate. That's one of the roles of the commission. And when a water system or entity comes and asks to move water from one basin to another for various purposes, and it requires their certificate, it goes to the commission. It comes to this committee first. So I regularly give updates on those types of projects to the Water Allocation Committee. This is going to be I do this sort of a basics primer presentation with some regularity, especially when there's new members here, so you have an understanding of what the law is, what the statute, the rules say. And this is intended to be, it's certainly formal, but if you have any questions as I go through, please ask them as we move through this. It'll go a little smoother if questions and discussions happen as this presentation goes. And certainly at the end, there'll be time for some questions. Here's just a quick outline on what I'm going to cover. Go through some basics, the statute, the existing transfers, what the process is, and then examples, depending on how much time we have. We'll go through a couple of complicated examples. This is water supply, which means it often gets kind of complicated. And we currently have, there's one request going through the process. I'll give an update on where we are in that process. But there are a number of other entities in the state who have come to us. They come to us with some regularity, talking about potentially submitting, getting into this IBT process. So this is only one. Within the next year, there may be more. All right, right off the top, the definition. So we're talking about is the withdrawal of surface water. This is only dealing with surface waters. Groundwater is not part of the interbasin transfer law. And it's moving from one river basin to another one, discharging to another one. So you have a source basin and a receiving basin. These are terms you'll hear. The purpose of the interbasin transfer law is to ensure it's good public policy to move water between basins. So here's the statute. What we're talking about, so there's three that are in the statute. It's really that first one is the one that we see pretty much all the time. We're talking about 2 million gallons a day, transferring from one basin to another, 2 million gallons a day or more. And this is based on, it says here in the statute, it's the average, the calendar month we use. So there's no compliance issues. We look at average day over a max month of the year. So oftentimes we're talking about July or August of the year, where a water system will be estimating how much water they'll be transferring. There is a ceiling of 3 million gallons a day. That's usually not, it's usually that 2 million gallon average day over max month. The second one talks about increasing by 25% above what was the pre-existing transfer of when the statute was codified in July 1993. And the third one is increasing an existing transfer from, once again, approved by the commission from when it was codified in July 93. Like I said, it's that first one, the 2 million gallons a day is the one to really focus on. So let's jump into an example of what I'm talking about for an interbasin transfer. The top bullet is critical. The transfer equals the withdrawal minus the return. So we're looking at a net transfer, not the gross amount of water that's going across the basin boundary. So in example one, you'll see that there's the town and its service area boundaries is a circle here. And the basin boundary cuts right down the middle of the circle. They're withdrawing 10 million gallons a day. And they are discharging 5 into the receiving basin. What's important to notice here is what is the consumptive use. So there's another term we often use. The consumptive use is that amount of water that isn't collected by that wastewater system, but rather is discharged right there by the user. So we're talking about irrigation, septic in some places where they don't collect, where the centralized wastewater isn't collected. So in the source basin, the consumptive use is 2, and in the receiving basin, the consumptive use is 3. So by that measure, the net transfer is 8 million gallons a day. The second example, and admittedly, these are simple examples, but the second example, once again, that town is withdrawing 10 million gallons a day, and the service area is still using 5 consumptively, but the basin boundary is the basin boundary is below the town. So the town is using consumptively entirely within the receiving basin. In this example, they actually return the wastewater treatment plant is in the source basin. So they return 5. So the total net transfer is 5. It's important to see that second example, because even though they're returning that water back to the source basin, consumptively, they're using more than that 2 MGD threshold. And so they would be required to get a certificate from the EMC. I just talked a lot about basins and basin boundaries. So this is the basin boundary map. So this map was created by the General Assembly, 91. It's in the 93 statute. It roughly follows the Huck 8 boundaries. It follows them fairly closely in the western part of the state. And in the eastern part of the state, there are places where it deviates from those Huck 8 boundaries. A few key areas to note is that right in the center there, 18-3, the Uwharrie Basin isn't really, it doesn't show up as a separate basin in a Huck 8. And then there are some other places in the eastern part of the state where, like I said, it varies. You have any questions?
Yes, Mr. Brady, would you tell us what Huck 8 encompasses?
I'm sorry.
That's quite.
So that's the USGS Hydrologic Unit Code, what we use for really most all of the other programs in Division of Water Resources. And federally, that's certainly what they use is the Huck unit. So there's a 6, which would roughly be, say, the Neuse River, I believe, is a Huck 6. And then it goes up to 10, 12. The watersheds keep getting smaller and smaller. I only mention that because a lot of folks are more familiar with the Hydrologic Unit Code or the Huck units than they are with the IBT basins, which, like I said, were created and codified by the General Assembly itself. There are 18 of them. And you see they're numbered by, that first number is the major basin, and the second number signifies the sub-basin. And statutorily, it doesn't really matter whether when you're talking about the 2 MGD and getting a certificate, it doesn't matter whether you're moving it between a sub-basin or a major basin. You're still coming to the EMC for a certificate. The process can be a little different, but not much. All right. Any questions on the basins? All right. So here's just sort of a snapshot. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a?
No question. I was just thinking we're taking in a lot of information and there might be questions on the basin in the future.
When we get to the examples, there might be some questions.
I think there might be. Thank you.
So this is an interesting snapshot to give you perspective on what interbasin transfers, IBTs, look like in North Carolina. Most of the municipalities, maybe I shouldn't say most, a lot of municipalities across the state, water systems, they have their service areas, they build them on ridge lines. It makes a lot of sense. So because if you have a water system built on a ridge line and you have a single source, well, that source is going to be in one basin. And then it depends. So part of your service area will obviously be into a different basin. So you will have some consumptive loss. And depending upon where a water system puts its wastewater treatment plant, depends whether or not you're going to end up with a larger transfer or not. So there are over 130 water systems, last time we checked, with surface water transfers. Mainly they were built on built on ridge lines, if you will. 80% are under 1 MGD. So we're talking about small water systems. For perspective, in the local water supply planning program, which is also in my branch, the water supply planning branch, there are roughly 550 water systems across the state that have to do a local water supply plan, to give you some perspective on what that 130 number represents. There are only 9 IBT certificates that have been issued since the statute originated in 93. Maybe I should say 91. The pre-existing transfer allows for systems that were already or had the ability to transfer 2 million gallons or more a day prior to that statute being codified in July 93. It's a line in the sand. The statute provided a line in the sand for water systems that already had existing infrastructure in the ground. There are a couple of dozen systems across the state, water systems across the state that have a pre-existing transfer allowance. And there are a handful of water systems that are transferring between 1 and 2 MGD. And so what we do is we use the local water supply planning program to try to make sure that compliance is met, to check in on the water systems to make sure that they're remaining compliant with that this 2 MGD statute. Before I move on, I'm talking a lot about water systems here because that's who all the 9 certificates have been issued to water systems. This statute, though, it doesn't just apply to water systems. Any water user that requires a basin transfer would be subject to an IBT certificate if they had the need to have one. There's a pre-existing allowance for Duke, for the Allen Steam Station in Charlotte, because they're right on that peninsula, if you will, between the South Fork Catawba and the Catawba River, and they move water from the South Fork, and it sort of passes through and goes to the Catawba. That was already in place prior to the statute being written. But I do want to make that point, that this is all water users in the state are subject. All right, so let's talk about the 9. I'm not going to belabor this one too bad. You can see the details here. The first one being Piedmont Triad. That's Lake Randleman, effectively. Sending water to, a lot of that goes to Greensboro, and then Greensboro discharges into the Hall. Some of it goes to High Point, and their discharge, some of that discharge goes to the Yadkin. Charlotte in 2002, from the Catawba to the Rocky. Concord Kannapolis, which some of you may remember that one. That one was contested, or not contested, but contentious, if you will. They withdraw water both from the Catawba and the Yadkin, but all their discharges to the Rocky. Greenville, Brunswick County. Brunswick was the first one I worked on, and that's a coastal system which follows a little bit of a different process. And that's from the Cape Fear, because they withdraw their water from lower Cape Fear water and sewer intake there at Lock 1 on the Cape Fear River. And then they have some discharges into they have a service area and discharges into the Shallotte and Waccamaw basins. Cary and Apex. So Cary actually had the first certificate issued in '89. This 2015 date marks the most recent modification to that certificate. And obviously they withdraw out of Jordan Lake and have a considerable amount of their service area in the Neuse Basin and discharge into the Neuse. Carr Regional, which is a very large regional system, discharging most of it to the Tar, but there is a little bit that goes to the Neuse and Fishing Creek. Union County, that one was much talked about 5-6 years ago. They withdraw out of Tillery, and they just started this year actually doing that. Their water treatment plant is built, and I think it was in April or May of this year is when they really began doing that, making that transfer happen and discharging into the Rocky. And then the most recent one is Pender County, another coastal system. That was a lot. Are there any questions? Okay.
Actually, Mr. Brady, would you explain again about the Cary Apex amounts and their sources? I heard you talk about the Neuse River, but I don't, but could you just go into a little bit more detail with that?
Right. So, and thank you. So the Cape Fear, they withdraw out of Jordan Lake. It is within the Cape Fear major basin, but it's in the Hall subbasin. So they're withdrawing out of the Hall subbasin, which is Jordan, They have considerable amount of service area in the Neuse, and they have the Middle Creek wastewater plant. They have another one as well. They have some discharge wastewater plants in the Neuse Basin. You'll see a 31 there. That signifies the Neuse River, how much is being transferred to the Neuse, and 2 to the Cape Fear. Now, this is not what they're doing today. All of these certificates are based on a 30-year planning horizon. So when they came in when they received that certificate in 2015, they were basing their projections on what they suspect will be happening in 2045. So by 2045, they're projecting that 31 will be going to the Neuse and that 2 will be going to the Cape Fear sub-basin. So you have if you will, you have the Haw and the Deep. I have to reverse it around your perspective. The Haw and the Deep join, it's the Cape Fear, and then that Cape Fear all the way down to the Atlantic covers that. When you get closer to the coast, it breaks it out into, I can show the map. It breaks it out into the Black and the Northeast and the New. But 2-3 is the Cape Fear sub-basin in the Cape Fear major basin. Is that confusing enough? But that's what those numbers that are beside there, that's what they signify. And like I said, this is not what they're doing today. This is what they're doing in that 30-year window planning horizon, starting roughly from the year of the issuance of the certificate.
Commissioner Deerhague has a question.
May I, as a visitor, ask a question or make an observation? To put this in the scheme of our actual 17 river basins, the Rocky River is in the Yadkin PD basin, right?
Right.
So we have 3 cases where there are large discharges into the Yadkin PD basin. And then we've also heard in the past year that the Rocky River is becoming a greater and greater concern because of its water quality issues. And I'll be curious at some point to ask you where these discharge points are relative to the areas of impairment that are being seen. And we can talk with the water quality staff too about that. But crossing over between committees, I just wanted to make that observation.
Your point is well taken. I certainly subscribe to the idea of the one water, where the withdrawals and the discharge together matter. And your point's well taken regarding the Rocky.
Thank you.
Yeah. The IBT process. All right, so here we go. Here's the process. There's a lot of boxes and a lot of movement here, but I'm going to break it down. There's 3 steps. The first step is called the notice of intent. This is when a water system comes to the commission and it's as simple as a letter. It says, we intend to request an interbasin transfer for X amount. Now that's before they've done any significant detailed studies on how much water they're actually going to be transferring 30 years out. It's mainly to a notice that this is what we're going to be requesting from the commission. There are 3 public meetings held. They are the responsibility of the applicant to hold those meetings. And then there are comments following that. The second step gets into the environmental document. And it depends on the statute, whether it's going to be an EA or an EIS. But either way, there will be a public hearing and comments as normal with a public hearing. This is the responsibility of the commission. When we get to public hearings as opposed to public meetings, the commission has the responsibility to have a hearing officer and work with the department on establishing that.
Question, who determines whether it's an EA or an EIS, and what is the criteria for that decision?
Right. So in the statute, if it's a sub-basin transfer, this is where we get into the differences between a sub-basin and a major basin transfer. If it's a sub-basin transfer, only an EA is required. If it's a major basin transfer, then an EIS is required. Also, if it's a coastal, I mentioned some coastal transfers. If it's a coastal transfer, then an EA is all that's required by the statute. Now, it has to follow all of this because we're dealing in SEPA now, State Environmental Policy Act. It has to subscribe or meet the requirements of SEPA. And oftentimes, the applicant, after looking at what the requirements in IBT statute are, the requirements in the SEPA statute, they will elect, even if they don't have, if it's a sub-basin transfer, they will elect to go ahead and doing an EIS. But the minimum criteria for I'd mentioned the minimum criteria for those. That's a question, thank you. So then that last step of the environmental document process gets into the adequacy. Now, this really just sort of skims the surface. The applicant submits to the division a initial draft document. We go through that internally, provide comments back to them on that, and then they resubmit that draft document. That draft document then goes out to agency review and to the state clearinghouse. That document then becomes, those comments are integrated. There's the public hearing mentioned, and then there's a final EIS, EA, and then a FONSI or a ROD are issued, and that goes back through clearinghouse. So that step can take quite a bit of time. That's the most lengthy step in these 3 steps. But once you get through that, you get the 3rd step, and that is the petition phase. Now, the petition document uses the environmental document as its source for technical information. But whereas the environmental document is really trying to be unbiased, looking at all the alternatives, deciding what the preferred alternative is, and going step by step. The petition document, since it is a petition, they're requesting a specific action from the commission. It is saying, here, we're using this technical information here from the environmental document, and this is the best alternative based on the information that's provided. So it's a little bit more of a persuasive document, if you will, the petition document. I skipped over this first part, is very important. Settlement. If there's let's just say there's a downstream party that contests the issuance of a certificate, in the statute, the place for that settlement discussion occurs between the environmental document and the petition document. That's by the statute. So then the EMC will issue a draft determination within 90 days of receiving that petition document. And then that goes out for really public review. And there are at least 2 public hearings. So you got to have one in the source and you got to have one in the receiving basin to take care of those issues from 2 different parties, really, 2 different, there'll be multiple parties, but 2 basic differences in where they're living, if you will. And then comments will be accepted on that. A hearing officer's report will be issued. And the draft issuing the draft determination, and then the EMC issues a final determination. So that's the certificate. And I'll get through here in the next step, sort of statutory conditions and all. That's a lot of process stuff right there, pretty dry. Any questions? Yes.
How long does that process on average take?
From start to finish, it can vary widely. If we're talking about something, what I've seen in the coastal, it can be 2 years, 1.5 years, 2 years for something like a fairly simple coastal one. When you're getting into more complicated ones and ones that will be contested or litigated potentially, it can take multiple years. more than 5 would not be, would not be unusual and should be expected by the applicant.
Thank you.
Eric, one question. You may have said this. The record of decision, is it done by staff or does the EMC get an alternatives analysis, or is there just a preferred alternative that is given to the EMC?
So that, thank you. So that record of decision, that's the responsibility of the department. So there's the differentiation between the IBT statute and the SEPA statute. The SEPA requirements, that's the department's responsibility. So we're writing a ROD on that document where the department lands on it, or a FONSI for an EA. That is the department's responsibility. The EMC statutorily does have a responsibility to determine the adequacy of the environmental document. Yeah, that's in statute to determine whether or not the environmental document is adequate to move forward to the petition phase. Thank you, Tim.
Another question. The public meetings pursuant to the SEPA process, those are convened by the applicant.
That's right.
Then the public hearings,
What
once the petition comes out, those are convened by the department.
the steps 2 and 3 are commission hearings.
But the public meetings.
The public meetings in step 1, that's applicant led.
Okay.
So there
So
would,
in step 2, those are commission.
those are commission. Step 2 is commission. So there wouldn't, so in step 1, there's not going to be a hearing officer's report. And in step 1, it's difficult for the public often because there isn't really the analysis has been done. It's just an announcement that we're going to request to the EMC to look for an IBT certificate. And so you often get comments that are very, very broad-based comments because there's nothing to really focus, you're somebody who contested a concern except a very, a general idea of like, I don't like the idea of you moving water from one river basin to another one, which is a very valid and real concern. I'm not diminishing that. But once you get to 2 and 3, you start getting more detailed public comments on the information that's provided in those. Oftentimes, the number for the transfer that's issued in that NOI will be different than the number that actually comes out. When they go through and they do the demand analysis for their water system, a detailed audit of their water system. Number 2, when you get to step 2, that number often changes from what you see in step 1. That I think in nearly everyone I've worked on, that number is different. So that is to be expected as well. I think I may have talked a little bit about this, touched on these a little bit, but let me just go through these important points here. I mentioned this, but the environmental document provides background technical information required to make sound decisions, and the petition presents that technical information in a more persuasive way, if you will. Here's the EMC. So this is very important. The EMC's role can grant the petition. Can grant a certificate from the petition in whole, in part, deny it flat out, require any mitigation measures to minimize the detrimental effects that have been discovered or found during that environmental process. The statute provides the commission considerable leeway when it comes to issuing a certificate. There are specific conditions that the statute outlines, but the EMC has the ability to add more conditions as it sees fit and as it sees fit in the situation of the project. This next one is very important. The 9 findings of fact. This is in the statute. It's listed in the statute. Did I skip right over? I did skip right over it. Okay, I didn't say it's up front, and I should have. This presentation is what I give whenever I do the public hearings or public meetings. This is the same presentation that I'm giving to the audience at those hearings and meetings. And this is the slide I really lean on with the folks with the folks who came to those hearings and meetings, because it's important for folks when they're providing comments to be able to focus those comments in ways that the commission, by the statute, are most useful to establishing your decision, any conditions, and any conditions that were required. So let's just go through these 9 points of light. Number one, necessity, reasonableness, proposed uses, that's establishing a purpose and need of the project. That's really what that's trying to do. So it has to have a strong purpose and need for this transfer. Number 2 and number 3 deal with the source basin, both the direct impacts to the source basin from the withdrawal and transfer of water and the indirect impacts from that transfer of water. 4 is the receiving basin impacts, both direct and indirect. 5 looks at, are the alternatives that are presented reasonable? Are these all reasonable alternatives? And are there any more alternatives that were not evaluated that should be? 6 looks at, is this an impounded storage, the impounded storage capacity, is this an impoundment? Certainly if it's a run of river, if you're pulling it straight out of the noose, then that would be different than if you're pulling it out of Falls Lake. 7 deals with a very similar issue, but storage allocations from the Corps of Engineers reservoir. Commissioner Weiss early on mentioned that this body works with the Jordan Lake allocations. And so that would be applicable here. But there are 4 core reservoirs in the state. 8 considers where that service area, where the service area of the water system lands as opposed to where the basin boundary is. And going way back to those first couple of examples, I showed where the service area boundary cuts right through the service area boundary, the basin boundary comes right through the service area of the water system. And then in the second example, the service area is completely within the receiving basin. And by statute, that is something that should be considered when issuing the certificate. And then as I mentioned before, the statute provides the commission considerable flexibility and any other facts necessary to make your decision. All right, so a few conditions specific to that are specifically listed in the statute. A little coffee. Okay, so there are 3 documents that would have to be included. One's a water conservation plan. One of them is a drought management plan, and the other is compliance and monitoring plans. The conservation plan is important because, as the statute reads, that any entity that is getting that transfer, they must meet or exceed any of the water conservation plans, if you will, water conservation measures in that source basin, from any other water system in that source basin. So there's also quarterly monitoring reports. This is important for the commission to understand that there's the ability, even once you issue the certificate, there is the statutory ability to reopen, amend, and modify the certificate as necessary. If new information comes on, if a new reservoir comes online, and that there's no selling of transferred water to water systems that are not listed as co-applicants. The statute wants to make it clear that if you're transferring water, this is for a demand need of your service area and not really an opportunity to profit necessarily out of getting an IBT certificate. You need to be, it's about demand management. And as I said before, the EMC may impose additional conditions as necessary. All right, now that examples, I'm going to take a glance at the, okay.
Harold, one question on the last one. Conservation plan is use and not necessarily conservation of the resource. Effects of natural, impacts to natural resources, whatever, it's use, correct?
That's a good point. Yes, this is demand, conservation of demand. So are you alternating watering, irrigation water days, low flow, shower fixtures? There's a litany of water conservation measures, and every system is required to have a water shortage response plan. And so as you work your way through those water shortage response plans, there are triggers and reactions that customers have to reduce their water demand. And so that's really where those water conservation plan becomes important as things start getting less flow, less water available. Right now, it hasn't rained in a while, so it's starting to get a little drier. So systems are starting to go into these water conservation stages. But yes, it's about demand management and not necessarily the ecology or the resource itself.
Is there a part of this that looks at the ecology, the demand on the natural resource itself, or is it only consumption?
Looking at when you get into the EIS and EA, what the impacts would be to the natural resources, that's where that trigger is.
It's not carried forward in the plan.
Maybe not directly in the petition, but it's certainly the alternatives, the alternative selection looks at what are our impacts to the resource. I'll point to an example with Charlotte, where in a group they transfer the water to the Rocky. It's in the Goose Creek watershed, and the Goose Creek watershed has a Carolina heel splitter management plan. And so for a time, Charlotte was limited as to how much water it could transfer into that Goose Creek watershed until it was demonstrated that this transfer wouldn't have a negative impact on that species, the Carolina heel splitter, federally protected.
Follow-up question, if I could.
Please.
So the plan is set out, you said earlier, 35, 45 years?
30.
30. So you use the same data every 2 years or 5 years in that period? Are you cross-referencing this data to stay up to date on what the need is over that period of, let's just say, Phil started today over a 30-year period? Would you bring in this data on demand?
So
Something that's knowing the percentages you're using over that period of time and the demand cycle.
right. So as you're, when the analysis is done, say in 2015, the analysis is done looking at what our best guess for 2045 is. And once that certificate's issued, and I'm using Cary right there. Let's just look at Cary. 2015, 31. Cary would be allowed to transfer. In 2016, they would have been allowed to transfer 31 MGD. You know, it's 31. That number, we have to have a basis for the analysis. And so that's where that 30-year planning horizon comes in. So once they're 10 years in, you would expect, because they did that analysis, you know, and you can see in the documents, they will do it in 5-year increments,
Okay.
roughly. Some systems will do it in a year increment. That's a difficult to guess what's going to happen year by year. Certainly, a year like 2020 throws everything out the window.
But they're required to monitor it.
They are required to monitor it.
And
Absolutely.
then do we have staff to pick that up every 2 or 3 or 5 years to see what the productivity is and the usage is in that region for that particular basin?
Absolutely. So we look at every quarterly report.
Okay.
The ones that are required to report quarterly, the systems that are required to report annually, we'll look at, just that annual, but a lot of them now are required to report quarterly. And we check that number. So when that value gets to 80% of what that certificate threshold is, that's when we're having conversations. that's when we're asking for a plan. All right, what's your plan moving forward on getting either a modified certificate, or are you going to put another wastewater treatment plant that's in the source basin and start, and avoid another certificate, another issuance of a certificate? We need a plan and start working through that. When they get to 90%, that's when it's more than a plan. We're starting to have action now on what you're planning, what we're going to, you need to start enacting that plan if you haven't already. Most of the time when water systems get to that 80%, the plan is making a plan and starting to move forward. Because North Carolina is continuing to, as you all know, continuing to grow at an extremely rapid pace, and so it will catch them off guard if not. For the most part, I would say that the projections have been pretty accurate in my time here, seeing that they actually, it's something like Charlotte. They're pretty much right on line with what they projected they would be at this point. And they got the issue, it was issued in 2002, so you can do the math, they're about 9 years out.
I'd throw in that the municipalities are required to update their comprehensive land use plans every 10 years. And a lot of their projected need for water and sewer comes out of that planning process based on land use and consumption by land use and all that. So that's one reason their projections are pretty good.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have time to really go through these examples. I don't. So I'm going to go right into the current requested transfers. It's the town of Fuquay-Varina. So the notice of intent was for a requested 4 MGD. We have since received an initial draft EIS. The division has issued internal comments back to the applicant and their consultant, and they are still working through those comments. And I've recently heard that we should expect around the end of the year, first of next year, a revised EIS document to come through. That we will then internally evaluate the information, responses to those comments, like we do with any environmental document, responses to the comments. If we are satisfied with the responses to the comments, then we'll move that draft EIS document to that effectively that second stage, and we'll be talking about having a public hearing. That draft EIS document will go through State Clearinghouse. So then it's a broader agency review and as well as public review.
Who is their consultant?
Hazen and Sawyer. And I mentioned this. So Fuquay is their source basin is the Cape Fear River. Right now, they get their water from Harnett County. Primarily, they get their water from a few different sources. Most of it comes from Harnett County, which is in the Cape Fear River. They are expected to get their water from Sanford. They've entered into a contract agreement with Sanford. Sanford is expanding their water treatment plant right now, going through the process. And Fuquay-Varina has an existing Terrible Creek wastewater treatment plant that currently discharges less than 2 MGD, so they're within compliance of the IBT statute, but they've been issued a discharge permit for up to 6 MGD discharging into Terrible Creek. Terrible Creek is which is a terrible name for this, but it's a tributary to the Neuse River. So therein lies the basin transfer. And you can see, I mean, Fuquay-Varina is right there, built on the ridgeline. So that basin boundary cuts right through the middle of town. Approximately 60% of their projected demand will be on the Neuse side. So about 40% of it projected will be in the Cape Fear side of it. Yeah. Any questions on this specific one? As I mentioned before, I'm only talking about this one today. Within the next year, I would not be surprised if there aren't more coming to the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brady. We'll be calling on you frequently, I'm sure.
And I apologize for taking up all the time before I got into the examples, but I really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, at this point, we've completed all the items on our agenda for today. Unless any committee members have comments, I will adjourn the meeting. May I do that by consent, Mr. Reynolds? Yeah, all right. Then we'll stand adjourned. Staff has asked me to let you know that they will provide some sustenance for the commission members after about 10:30. So, thank you.
Madam.
Oh,
Chair,
yes, Mr. King, Commissioner King.
A question on the basins being assigned, I guess, to members, that we did something like that a couple of years ago. And with new members coming in, with that, Miriam did really good with her visits. I tried, I know JD did with the news, but are those new members going to pick up basins as we did, you think?
That's a good point.
I'm not aware of the assignments, so I will defer to Commissioner Deerhake to respond.
Thank you. Just for everyone's information, a few years ago, we decided that it would be a good idea, since we had 17 river basins and 15 members, that each member would take on at least one or more basins, or for the very large basins, a portion of a large basin. And so for those of you who are new to the commission, with the departure of other commissioners, you can find out what basins they were kept paying closer attention to. And the whole point being that if one commissioner gets to know a basin, gets to know the issues, all of the natural resources in that basin, and then they can help the commission understand how things are progressing between the 10-year basin management plan that is brought to the commission for review and approval. And by the way, water allocation is a component of the basin management plan. So it's a good opportunity for one member to get to know closer the basin, and then they would be a good voice for any details other commissioners may need if we have votes coming before us or information items before us that need everyone's careful consideration. So, Mr. Keene, do you have any other?
No, ma'am.
Does that
Just thought
capture
about
it
that
well?
as we-
So we had one person who was responsible for the basin management plan sitting in. She just left a minute ago. Michelle Raquet. And she will be glad to talk with you, and we work with us and the chair in making sure you find a basin that you're comfortable working with. If we need to move things around amongst the members, you could either find one that's in your home basin, or you could do like I do, and I journey out to the southwestern part of the state, southwestern corner in the mountains, which a beautiful area. Didn't get there this year, but I do have a small report from a staff member that I can share with folks if they want.
Thank you for that information, Commissioner Deerhake, and thank you for the question, Commissioner Keene. So at this point, we will stand adjourned.